He was ready to begin a new life with the woman chosen for him, but when she disappeared on the day of their wedding, everything changed. Alone, humiliated, and seeking solitude, the Comanche warrior found something he didn't expect. A white woman, broken but alive. What he did next would define not only his future but hers as well. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas sun blazed mercilessly across the Comancheria in the summer of 1853, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. Near the banks of the Colorado River, the Nakoni band of the Comanche had gathered for what should have been a joyous occasion, a wedding that would unite two prominent families and strengthen the bonds within the tribe. Kitano, whose name meant sacred dancer, stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, his muscular frame adorned with traditional wedding attire, intricate beadwork gleaming against his bronze skin. His long black hair was braided with eagle feathers, symbols of his prowess as a warrior, who had counted coup numerous times against enemy tribes and the encroaching white settlers. At 24 summers, he was considered one of the finest warriors in the band, his reputation built on courage, skill with both lance and bow, and an unwavering loyalty to his people. The woman he was meant to marry, Numukatu, meaning travels everywhere, had been promised to him since childhood. Their union had been arranged by their fathers, both respected elders, who believed the match would produce strong children and unite their influence within the tribe. Kitano had accepted this arrangement without question, as was the custom, though his heart had never truly connected with Numukatu. She was beautiful, skilled in the women's arts, and came from good lineage, everything a Comanche warrior could want in a wife. Yet as he stood waiting for the ceremony to begin, a strange emptiness settled in his chest, a feeling he could not name or understand. The drums began their rhythmic beating, and the people gathered in a wide circle, their faces painted for celebration. The medicine man, Pahayuko, raised his arms to bless the union, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd in the sacred language of their ancestors. Kitano's mother, Tupi, smiled with pride from her place among the women, her eyes glistening with tears of joy. His father, the war chief Tosawi, stood tall and stoic, his weathered face showing approval of this match that would further secure his son's position within the tribe. But Numukatu did not appear. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still she did not come to the ceremonial circle. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, confusion turning to concern, and then to whispers of scandal. Finally, one of Numukatu's friends, a young woman named Kasa, approached Tosawi with downcast eyes and spoke words that would change everything. Numukatu had fled during the night with a warrior from a visiting band, a man named Paiha, whom she had met during the spring buffalo hunt. They had fallen in love and could not bear to be separated, so they had chosen to run away together rather than dishonor the arranged marriage through reluctance and resentment. The shame that fell upon Kitano was immediate and crushing. In Comanche society, to be abandoned at one's own wedding was a humiliation that called into question a warrior's worth, his ability to provide, his attractiveness as a mate. The ceremony dissolved into chaos as Numukatu's father, Mowaka, rushed to his teepee in rage and shame, while Tosawi's face grew dark with anger not at his son, but at the family who had raised such a disrespectful daughter. The celebration feast was abandoned, the gifts returned, and the people dispersed in uncomfortable silence, leaving Kitano standing alone in the ceremonial circle, the setting sun casting long shadows across his solitary figure. That night, Kitano rode out from the camp alone, his heart heavy with humiliation and confusion. He pushed his horse, a powerful paint stallion named Windrunner, hard across the darkening plains, seeking solace in the vast emptiness of the land. The cool night air whipped against his face as he galloped, trying to outrun the shame that clung to him like smoke. He had always done everything right, earned his place as a warrior, shown respect to his elders, provided meat for his family, counted coup against enemies, yet still he had been found wanting. What was wrong with him that his own promised wife would choose another, would rather face the uncertainty of running away than spend her life with him? He rode until Windrunner was lathered with sweat, until the camp was far behind and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Finally, he slowed near a creek, allowing his horse to drink while he sat on the bank, staring at his reflection in the moonlit water. The face that looked back at him was strong, angular, with high cheekbones and intense dark eyes that had seen 19 winters of raiding and hunting. He was not ugly, not weak, not unworthy by any measure his people used. Yet he had been rejected, and that rejection cut deeper than any enemy blade ever had. As he sat in bitter contemplation, a sound caught his attention, a muffled cry that seemed to come from downstream. Instantly alert, Kitano rose and moved silently through the cottonwoods, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. The cry came again, definitely human, definitely distressed. He crept closer, using every skill he had learned as a warrior to move without sound, and what he saw made him freeze in shock. A white woman, bound and gagged, was tied to a tree near a small campfire. Two Comanche warriors from a different band, judging by their dress and the markings on their horses, sat nearby drinking whiskey they had likely traded for or stolen. The woman's dress was torn and dirty, her blonde hair matted and tangled, her face bruised and streaked with tears. She had clearly been a captive for some time, and from the rough treatment evident in her condition, she had not been treated with the respect that should be shown even to captives. Kitano's jaw tightened as he observed the scene. Among his people, captives were common, taken during raids on settlements and other tribes. Women and children were often adopted into Comanche families, becoming full members of the tribe if they proved adaptable. But these warriors were clearly not treating this woman as a potential tribal member. They were using her cruelly, keeping her bound and beaten, likely planning to trade her for whiskey or guns at one of the Mexican trading posts. One of the warriors stood and approached the woman, his intentions clear in his unsteady gait and leering expression. The woman's eyes went wide with terror, and she struggled against her bonds, her muffled screams becoming more desperate. Something in Kitano snapped. Perhaps it was the humiliation he had suffered that day. Perhaps it was a deeper sense of justice, or perhaps it was something in the woman's eyes, a fierce determination to survive even in the face of overwhelming fear, that called to something in his own spirit. He stepped from the shadows, his presence immediately commanding attention. The two warriors spun around, hands going to their weapons, but Kitano raised his hand in a gesture of peace, speaking in the Comanche tongue. He identified himself, his band, his father's position, and asked about the woman. The warriors, both younger and less experienced than Kitano, relaxed slightly but remained wary. They told him they had taken her from a wagon 3 days' ride to the east, that her family had fought but been killed, and that they planned to trade her to the Comancheros. Kitano made them an offer. He had brought gifts for his wedding, fine horses and weapons that were now useless to him. He would trade 3 horses and a rifle for the woman. The warriors exchanged glances, clearly surprised but also tempted. 3 horses and a rifle were worth far more than what they would get from the Comancheros, who always drove hard bargains. After some haggling and posturing, they agreed. The transaction was completed swiftly. Kitano returned to where he had left Windrunner, retrieving the horses he had brought as bride gifts, along with a fine rifle he had won in a raid. The warriors examined their new acquisitions with satisfaction, mounted up, and rode off into the night without a backward glance at their former captive, already planning what they would do with their newfound wealth. Alone now with the woman, Kitano approached her slowly, speaking in gentle tones, though he knew she likely could not understand his words. Her eyes followed his every movement, still filled with terror, her body trembling. He knelt beside her and carefully removed the gag from her mouth, then began working on the rawhide strips that bound her wrists and ankles. The bindings had been tied cruelly tight, cutting into her skin and leaving raw, bloody marks. As he worked to free her, she remained rigid, watching him with the wariness of a trapped animal. When the last binding fell away, she scrambled backward, nearly falling in her weakness and haste to put distance between them. Kitano remained where he was, making no move to pursue or restrain her. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly, then gestured to the creek, mimicking drinking. She stared at him, her chest heaving, clearly trying to understand his intentions. He repeated the gesture, then slowly stood and walked to the creek, cupping his hands to drink, showing her it was safe. After a long moment of hesitation, she crawled to the water's edge and drank desperately, her hands shaking as she brought the cool water to her cracked lips. She drank until she was satisfied, then sat back, hugging her knees to her chest, and finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse and broken, but the words were English. She said her name was Sarah Mackenzie. She was 19 years old. She had been traveling with her father, stepmother, and younger half-brother from Missouri to California, seeking a new life in the gold fields. The attack had come at dawn. Her father had tried to fight but had been overwhelmed. She had watched her family die before being taken. Kitano understood none of her words, but he understood the pain in her voice, the grief and trauma that echoed in every syllable. He had seen enough death and loss in his own life to recognize it in another. He made a decision in that moment, one that would alter the course of both their lives. He would not abandon her to die in the wilderness, nor would he sell her or trade her. She was now under his protection. The journey back to the Noconi camp took 2 days, and during that time, an uneasy truce formed between Kitano and Sarah. He had fashioned a simple shelter each night, given her his spare blanket, and shared his dried meat and pemmican. She watched him constantly, still afraid, still uncertain of her fate, but gradually recognizing that this man was different from the ones who had brutalized her. He made no move to harm her, kept a respectful distance, and though they could not speak each other's languages, he communicated through gestures and actions that she was safe with him. Sarah Mackenzie had been a school teacher's daughter back in Missouri, educated and refined, raised with dreams of a proper life with a husband from a good family, children, and a white picket fence. The journey west had been her father's dream, not hers, but she had loved him enough to follow. Now everything she had known was gone, torn away in moments of violence and blood. She was a captive among the very people she had been taught to fear, the savage Comanche who raided settlements and took scalps. Yet this warrior, this man who had purchased her, treated her with a gentleness she had not expected, a respect that confused her understanding of who these people were. When they arrived at the Noconi camp, the reaction was immediate and intense. People emerged from their teepees to stare at Kitano riding in with a white woman seated on a horse beside him. The shame of his abandoned wedding was still fresh in everyone's mind, and now he returned with a captive, a white woman no less. The whispers started immediately, speculation running wild through the camp like prairie fire. Some thought he had taken her in anger, to prove his manhood after being rejected. Others believed he intended to use her as a slave to work for his household. Few elders murmured that perhaps he would adopt her, as was sometimes done with captives who showed promise of adapting to Comanche life. Tosawi met his son at the edge of camp, his expression unreadable. The war chief examined Sarah with calculating eyes, noting her condition, her fear, but also something else, a strength in her bearing despite her circumstances. He spoke to Kitano in their language, his tone demanding explanation. Kitano explained how he had found her, what he had paid for her, and his intention to keep her under his protection. Tosawi listened, then asked the question that hung in the air like smoke. What exactly did his son plan to do with this white woman? Kitano's answer surprised even himself. He declared that he would take Sarah as his wife, that she would replace the one who had shamed him. The pronouncement sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd. Taking a white captive as a wife was not unheard of. Many Comanche warriors had done so over the years, and some of those women had become valued members of the tribe, bearing children who grew to be respected warriors and mothers. But to do so immediately after being abandoned at a wedding, to bring her directly into camp and make such a declaration, it was bold, perhaps reckless, and it would either restore Kitano's honor or compound his humiliation depending on how events unfolded. Tosawi studied his son for a long moment, searching his face for the reasoning behind this decision. Finally, he nodded slowly. If this was Kitano's choice, he would support it, but the woman would need to prove herself worthy of joining their people. She would need to learn their ways, their language, their customs. If she could adapt, if she could become Comanche in spirit if not in blood, then the marriage would be acceptable. If she could not, if she remained forever white in her heart and mind, then she would bring shame upon Kitano's household, and Tosawi would not permit that, regardless of his love for his son. Sarah understood none of this conversation, but she felt the weight of the eyes upon her, the judgment and speculation. When Kitano helped her down from the horse and guided her toward his teepee, she stumbled, her legs weak from days of captivity and rough treatment. He caught her easily, his strong arm steadying her, and for a moment their eyes met. In his dark gaze, she saw something that startled her, not cruelty or lust, but a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own, a recognition of two souls who had been cast adrift by circumstances beyond their control. Inside the teepee, Kitano's mother Tupi was waiting, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had heard the commotion and knew her son had returned with a white captive. When she saw Sarah's condition, the bruises, the cuts, the evidence of mistreatment, her maternal instincts overcame her uncertainty. She immediately set about caring for the girl, heating water, gathering healing herbs, and gesturing for Sarah to remove her tattered dress so her wounds could be tended. Sarah hesitated, her modesty warring with her desperate need for care and cleanliness. Tupi's gentle persistence and kind eyes finally convinced her. As the older woman cleaned her wounds and applied poultices to the worst of the bruises, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, not from physical pain, but from the simple human kindness being shown to her. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with gentleness, so long since she had felt anything but terror and pain. Over the following weeks, Sarah's life became a strange mixture of captivity and unexpected care. Tupi took charge of teaching her, showing her how to properly tan hides, how to prepare pemmican, how to gather roots and berries, how to maintain a household in the Comanche way. The work was hard, far harder than anything Sarah had done in her previous life, but Tupi was patient, demonstrating again and again until Sarah's soft hands became calloused and capable. The older woman also began teaching her the Comanche language, pointing to objects and repeating their names, acting out verbs, slowly building a vocabulary that would allow communication. Kitano remained respectful and distant, sleeping on the opposite side of the teepee, making no demands upon Sarah, despite having declared his intention to marry her. He provided meat from his hunts, brought her small gifts, a comb made from bone, a warm buffalo robe, soft moccasins to replace her worn boots, but he never forced his presence upon her. He understood that she had been through trauma, that trust would have to be earned slowly if it could be earned at all. Sarah found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He was undeniably handsome, his features strong and proud, his body powerful from years of warrior training. He moved with a grace and confidence that spoke of absolute mastery of his physical form, but it was his kindness that surprised her most. The gentle way he treated his mother, his patience with children who ran through the camp, his fairness in dealing with others. This was not the savage monster she had been taught to expect. This was a man of honor, bound by codes she did not yet understand, but could not help but respect. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Kitano returned from a successful hunt with a deer. As was custom, he shared the meat with those in need, the widows, the elderly, those whose hunters had not been fortunate. Sarah watched this generosity, this care for the community, and something shifted in her understanding. These people were not the mindless savages she had been taught about. They had structure, values, loyalty, and love. They cared for their own with a devotion that rivaled anything she had seen in white society. That night, as they sat by the fire inside the teepee, Sarah attempted to speak to Kitano in his language. Her pronunciation was terrible, her grammar non-existent, but she managed to string together a few words that approximated, "Thank you for saving me." Kitano's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his features, making him look younger, less burdened. He responded slowly, using simple words she might understand, telling her she was welcome, that she was safe here. Their conversations began that night, limited and halting, but growing more complex as Sarah's vocabulary expanded. Tupi helped translate when needed, her own understanding of some English words picked up from traders, allowing her to bridge the gap. Through these conversations, Sarah learned about Kitano, about his life as a warrior, his love for his people, his pain at being rejected by Numukatu. He, in turn, learned about her, about the white world she came from, the education she had received, the dreams she had held for her future before they were destroyed on that terrible dawn. As autumn approached and the leaves began to turn, the Nokoni band prepared for the annual buffalo hunt, a crucial time when they would gather meat and hides to sustain them through the winter. Kitano was expected to participate as one of the strongest hunters, but he was reluctant to leave Sarah behind. She had adapted remarkably well, learning quickly and working hard, but she was still an outsider, still vulnerable to those who might resent her presence or see her as a reminder of Kitano's humiliation. Sarah surprised him by insisting he go. Using her growing command of the Comanche language, she told him that she would be fine, that Tupi would watch over her, and that the tribe needed every capable hunter to ensure their survival through the winter. Her understanding of the importance of the hunt, her willingness to subordinate her own fears to the needs of the community, impressed not only Kitano, but also those who overheard the conversation. Perhaps this white woman could become one of them after all. The men left on a crisp morning, a party of 30 warriors riding out with pack horses and supplies for what would be a 2-week expedition. Sarah watched Kitano ride away on Windrunner and felt a surprising pang of worry. When had this man become important to her? When had his safety become something that mattered? She pushed the thoughts aside and threw herself into her work, helping the women prepare the camp for the hunter's return, gathering firewood, repairing teepees, and continuing her education in Comanche ways. During the men's absence, Sarah found herself more fully integrated into the women's society of the camp. Without Kitano's protection immediately visible, she had to prove herself through her own efforts and character. She worked harder than anyone, never complaining, always willing to help with the most difficult tasks. When one of the elderly women, Nomi, fell ill, Sarah sat with her through the night applying the remedies Tupi had taught her, bringing water and comfort. The old woman survived, and from that day forward, she became one of Sarah's most vocal supporters, telling anyone who would listen that the white woman had a good heart. The hunters returned triumphant, having found a large herd and taken many buffalo. The camp erupted in celebration, with feasting and dancing lasting late into the night. Kitano sought Sarah out immediately upon his return, and the relief and joy in her face when she saw him safe told him everything he needed to know about how her feelings had changed. He presented her with a buffalo robe he had specifically prepared for her, tanned to perfect softness, and decorated with his own hands using dyed quills in intricate patterns. That night, as the celebration continued around them, Kitano asked Sarah if she would truly consent to become his wife, not as a captive, not as property, but as a partner and equal. He had learned enough English by now, and she enough Comanche, that they could communicate in a mixture of both languages, understanding each other's meaning, if not always the exact words. Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there, and realized that somewhere during these months, she had fallen in love with this man who had saved her, protected her, and given her a new life when her old one had been destroyed. She said yes. The wedding ceremony took place on a cold November morning, with the entire Nokoni band gathered once more in the ceremonial circle. This time, there would be no abandonment, no shame, only the joining of two souls who had found each other through the most unlikely of circumstances. Sarah wore a dress of white deerskin that Tupi had made for her, decorated with intricate beadwork and fringe that swayed as she moved. Her blonde hair, now long and healthy again, was braided with ribbons and feathers, a blend of her white heritage and her new Comanche identity. Kitano stood tall and proud in his finest ceremonial dress, his face painted with the symbols of his warrior status, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she approached the circle. Pahayuko, the medicine man, performed the ceremony with great solemnity, blessing their union and asking the spirits to grant them many children, long life and happiness together. Unlike the first wedding that had ended in humiliation, this ceremony was filled with genuine joy and community support. The people had watched Sarah transform from a frightened captive into a woman who worked hard, showed respect, learned their ways, and brought light back into Kitano's eyes. They had seen how she cared for the sick, how she shared what little she had, how she laughed with the children and honored the elders. She had earned her place among them through her own merit, and now they celebrated her joining with one of their finest warriors. When the ceremony concluded, Kitano took Sarah's hand and led her through the camp as husband and wife. The celebration that followed was magnificent, with feasting on buffalo meat, dancing to the rhythmic drums, and gifts presented to the new couple from families throughout the band. Even those who had been skeptical of Sarah's presence now offered their congratulations and blessings. Tasawi himself presented his new daughter-in-law with a fine horse, a gesture that signified his complete acceptance of her into the family. As night fell and the celebration continued, Kitano and Sarah slipped away to their teepee, finally alone as husband and wife. Inside, a warm fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the buffalo hide walls. Kitano turned to Sarah, his strong hands gentle as he cupped her face, his dark eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation or fear. He found none. Sarah smiled up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight, and spoke in a mixture of Comanche and English, telling him that she loved him, that she chose this life, chose him, with full awareness and willing heart. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a celebration of the deep connection that had grown between them over the months. Kitano was gentle with Sarah, mindful of her past trauma, treating her with reverence and care. She responded to his touch with trust and love, giving herself to him completely, finding healing in their physical union. As they lay together afterward, wrapped in warm buffalo robes, Sarah marveled at how her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a captive facing a future of horror and degradation. Now she was a wife, a member of a community, a woman who had found love in the most unexpected place and with the most unexpected person. The winter that followed was harsh, with bitter cold and heavy snows that tested the endurance of the entire band. But inside Kitano and Sarah's teepee, there was warmth and happiness. They spent the long winter nights teaching each other, Kitano learning more English while Sarah became increasingly fluent in Comanche. He told her stories of his people's history, of great warriors and wise leaders, of the vast plains that were their homeland. She shared stories from her own past, tales of the white world she had come from, but increasingly those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else entirely. Sarah proved herself invaluable during that winter. Her education allowed her to help in unexpected ways, teaching some of the children to read and write in both English and Comanche, creating a written record of the band's oral histories that the elders found fascinating. She also used her knowledge of herbs and medicine, learned from her mother who had been a midwife, to assist Tupi in caring for the sick and injured. When a terrible influenza swept through the camp in January, Sarah worked tirelessly alongside the medicine man, using every remedy she knew to help save lives. Her efforts saved several children who might otherwise have died, cementing her reputation as a healer and earning the tribe's deep gratitude and respect. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Kitano with fierce joy and pride. He became even more protective of her, insisting she rest more, bringing her special foods, and constantly asking if she felt well. Sarah laughed at his anxious attention, assuring him that pregnancy was natural and that she was strong enough to continue her daily work. Tupi was overjoyed at the prospect of a grandchild, already beginning to prepare a cradleboard and tiny clothes. But with spring came also the reality of the changing world. White settlers were pushing further into Comanche territory, and tensions were rising. The United States Army had established more forts, and there were increasing skirmishes between soldiers and Comanche warriors. Kitano participated in several raids against white settlements, actions that troubled Sarah deeply. She understood the Comanche perspective, that these were their lands being invaded, their way of life being threatened. But she also knew the people being raided were much like her own family had been. Simple folks seeking a new life, not soldiers or politicians making war. One night, after Kitano returned from a particularly violent raid, Sarah confronted him. She was 7 months pregnant now, her belly swollen with their child, and the thought of bringing a baby into a world of increasing violence terrified her. Speaking in fluent Comanche, she told him of her fears, not just for their child, but for the future of his people. The United States was vast and powerful, with seemingly endless resources and soldiers. The Comanche were brave and skilled warriors, but they were finite in number, and every battle took lives that could not be replaced. Kitano listened to his wife's words, and they struck deep. He had seen the truth she spoke with his own eyes, the increasing number of soldiers, the better weapons they carried, the systematic way they were establishing control over the plains. He loved his people and their way of life, but he was not blind to reality. Other bands had already been forced onto reservations, their freedom taken, their proud warriors reduced to accepting government handouts. The thought of such a fate for the Nokoni filled him with rage and despair. But what alternative was there? Sarah suggested something radical. She proposed that Kitano speak with his father and the other leaders about finding a different path, not surrender, but strategic adaptation. Perhaps they could negotiate from a position of strength while they still had it, secure good terms that would preserve some of their autonomy and way of life, protect their children's futures, even if it meant changing how they lived. It was a controversial idea, one that would be seen as weakness by many warriors, but Sarah argued it was actually the bravest choice, to think of future generations rather than present glory. Kitano wrestled with this idea for many days. His identity as a warrior, his entire sense of self-worth, was bound up in the traditional Comanche way of life. To advocate for change felt like betraying everything he had been taught, everything he believed. But when he felt his child kick in Sarah's belly, when he imagined his son or daughter growing up on a reservation, stripped of freedom and dignity, he knew his wife spoke wisdom. Sometimes the hardest battles were not fought with weapons, but with difficult choices that required setting aside pride for survival. He approached his father Tosawi with Sarah's ideas, expecting anger or rejection. To his surprise, the old war chief listened carefully, his weathered face thoughtful. Tosawi admitted that he too had been thinking along similar lines, that he saw the writing on the wall even if he was reluctant to admit it. The world was changing, and the Comanche had to change with it or face extinction. Other elders were brought into the conversation, heated debates ensued, with young warriors arguing passionately for continuing the fight while older, wiser heads counseled caution and strategic thinking. In the end, a decision was made. The Nokoni band would send emissaries to negotiate with the army, not from weakness, but from strength, while they still had the ability to influence terms. Kitano was chosen as one of the emissaries, both because of his status as a respected warrior, and because his white wife could serve as translator and cultural bridge. Sarah, now 8 months pregnant, insisted on accompanying him despite the risks, arguing that her presence would show good faith and facilitate communication. The journey to Fort Belknap was tense and difficult. Sarah rode carefully, her pregnancy making travel uncomfortable, but she refused to slow the party down. When they arrived at the fort, the soldiers were initially hostile and suspicious, but the presence of an obviously pregnant white woman among the Comanche delegation confused and intrigued them. The fort's commander, Colonel Robert Morrison, agreed to meet with them, curious about what the Comanche wanted. The negotiations were complex and often frustrating. Sarah translated between Kitano and the colonel, trying to bridge not just language, but entirely different worldviews and values. The army wanted the Comanche to move to a reservation, give up raiding, and adopt farming. Kitano argued for a middle path, a large territory where his people could continue to hunt and live according to their traditions, with guarantees of autonomy and protection from white encroachment. Colonel Morrison was skeptical, saying he had no authority to grant such terms, but he agreed to forward the proposal to his superiors in Washington. During the week-long negotiations, Sarah went into labor. The timing could not have been worse, stuck at an army fort surrounded by potential enemies, but there was no choice but to endure. Kitano stayed by her side, his presence forbidden by Comanche tradition for births, but Sarah refusing to let him leave. A fort doctor, initially reluctant to help a Comanche woman, was shamed into providing assistance when Sarah reminded him of his Hippocratic oath in eloquent English that surprised him with its education and refinement. The birth was long and difficult, but finally, as dawn broke over the Texas plains, Sarah delivered a healthy baby boy. His first cries echoed through the fort, and when Kitano held his son for the first time, tears streamed down the warrior's face. This child, born of two worlds, symbolized both the past and the future, Comanche and white, a bridge between cultures. They named him Tahsikwa, meaning he who makes peace, a name that honored both his heritage and the mission that had brought them to this place. The birth had an unexpected effect on the negotiations. Colonel Morrison, himself a father, was moved by the sight of Kitano's devotion to his wife and newborn son. He began to see the Comanche not as faceless enemies, but as people with families, hopes, and fears, just like his own soldiers. He promised to argue strongly for fair terms when presenting the proposal to Washington, and he gave his word as an officer and gentleman that no harm would come to Kitano's family while they remained under his protection. 3 weeks later, word came back from Washington. The terms were not everything Kitano had hoped for, but they were better than what other tribes had received. The Nokoni band would be given a large reservation with good hunting land, relative autonomy in internal affairs, and protection from white settlers. They would have to cease raiding and accept some agricultural training, but they would not be forced to give up their language, religion, or core cultural practices. It was a compromise, not a victory, but it was survival with dignity, and that was worth more than a glorious but futile resistance. Kitano returned to his people with the treaty terms and his new son. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some warriors were angry, seeing it as surrender and humiliation. Others, particularly those with families, recognized the wisdom of securing their children's futures. Tosawi stood with his son, lending his authority and prestige to the decision, and gradually the band accepted that this was the path forward. The move to the reservation was painful, a mourning for the old free-roaming life, but it was not the cultural death sentence that many had feared. The Nokoni maintained their identity, their language, their traditions. Sarah became a crucial bridge between the Comanche world and the white authorities, translating, mediating, and advocating for her adopted people with a passion that came from genuine love and belonging. As years passed, Tasekwa grew strong and healthy, learning the ways of both his heritages. Sarah bore 2 more children, a daughter they named Elena after Sarah's mother, and another son named after Tosawi. The family became a symbol of what was possible, of peace between peoples, of love transcending cultural boundaries. Kitano never forgot that terrible day when he stood alone in the ceremonial circle, rejected and humiliated, but he came to see it as the greatest blessing of his life. Had Numukatu not run away, he would never have ridden out alone that night, never have found Sarah, never have known the deep, abiding love that now filled his days. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kitano took Sarah back to the place by the creek where he had first found her. They stood together, his arm around her waist, watching their 3 children play in the water. Sarah leaned into her husband's strength, marveling at the journey that had brought them from that night of terror and rescue to this moment of peace and family. She had lost everything once, but she had gained so much more. A husband who loved her with fierce devotion, children who were her joy, a community that had become her people, and a purpose that gave her life meaning. Kitano looked down at his wife, this remarkable woman who had come into his life when he needed her most, who had brought him not just love, but wisdom and a new vision for his people's future. He spoke softly in Comanche, telling her that she was his heart, his strength, his greatest blessing. Sarah smiled and responded in the same language, now as natural to her as English had once been, telling him that he was her home, her love, her everything. They kissed as the sunset painted the sky in brilliant reds and golds, their children's laughter ringing across the water, a perfect moment of happiness hard-won through courage, sacrifice, and love. The Comanche warrior who had been left alone at his wedding had indeed married a captured white woman, and what happened next was a love story that transcended cultures, a family that bridged worlds, and a legacy of peace that would echo through generations. Their story became legend among both the Comanche and the white settlers, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope and love could flourish, that understanding could replace hatred, and that 2 people from different worlds could build something beautiful together. Kitano and Sarah lived long lives, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and the respect of all who knew them, forever grateful for that fateful night when a humiliated warrior and a terrified captive found in each other not just rescue, but home.